Kismani, and this is Fulbright Women Podcast Season 2. We're excited to bring to you 20 new brilliant women who are pushing the boundaries in their fields and lives and serving as inspirations to so many around them. Joining us today is Hera Naguib. Hera is a poet and a PhD candidate in creative writing at Florida State University. She attended Sarah Lawrence as Fulbright Scholar to get a Master's in Fine Arts in Writing with a specialization in poetry. Her work has been published in journals such as New England Review, The Common, World Literature Today, the American Academy of Poets, and so many other prestigious publications. Thank you so much for finding time for this podcast. And there's so many things that I want to talk about. I do see so many poetries of yours, you share them online, they get published. But I guess I want to start with, when was the first time you were introduced to the idea of poetry? And what was that like?
I think it happened intuitively from reading. My parents, at a very early age, made sure that we develop a habit of reading. So every month we would go to the bookstore and we were allowed to buy one book. So it was kind of like on a rationed basis, so that it was made sure that, we kind of take our time to read that book and to savor it and not to kind of devour it. So there was a natural progression between just the love of reading and writing. So I remember from a very early age, I would just sit in my room, open a notebook, turn on the music and just write. It didn't start from poetry. It started from writing narratives, characters, fiction. And gradually, when we got our first computer, the writing moved to the computer. And I think poetry just happened to become an experimentation that I started doing with my best friend. I was very young. It was very bad, very amateurish. And we just used to write poems for one another. And that's really the first instance that I recall. I was 13 years old. We wrote my very first poem was dedicated to her. It was called my best friend, as silly as it sounds. But that's really where I first started writing poetry.
Interesting. So you did mention, you would put on music, make space for yourself. How did that, we always do that when we're doing some creative work, there is some space that we create. How has that creation of space evolved with time for you?
That's a really interesting question, because I think back to listening to music and the kind of sense of synchrony that I felt with myself while listening to music, and the words that were coming out of me, that no longer exists. I need a lot of quiet now to write, and I really need a lot of solitude. So it doesn't matter even if I'm in a house and in a room alone. I need a lot of space to myself. So I need an entire floor to myself to write. And I think one of those, the really early experiences of kind of creating that space with music and songs, it helped me kind of block out the world of the family around me. But then, it was more of an emotional space, and a space where I just needed to kind of let the feelings flow. So you're not thinking about craft as much when you're that young, right? So when you're old, craft requires a bit of, your logical mind to function as well. And that requires a sense of kind of quiet and ease, but also distance. I feel geographical distance is something that has helped me a lot in kind of reflecting back on the things that I want to write about, whether it's about my experience in Lahore, whether it's about my childhood in Saudi Arabia. But there's a kind of balance between how much distance you want. So I think what the Fulbright, our experience with being in the master's, and my experience here as a PhD student has given me a kind of right kind of distance in which I'm fortunate enough to travel back and forth, so that I can get enough geographical space to think about what I want to write, but also to revisit it and to, remember where I'm from and the subjects that, make me a writer.
Make you a writer. That is an interesting.
Well, it's a bold thing to say.
And So, Hera, I think about this thing a lot, and I'm going to come to distance and, some really interesting things that you touched upon. But make you a writer is something that you said towards the end. That is something that I think about a lot. Are
Mhm.
poets, writers, poets born, or one can be trained to become one?
I think the kind of sense of the sensitivity, intuition, curiosity for the world, I feel that those things are inborn. Um, and if you're not kind of born with that set of personality traits, I feel like, that artistic sensibility, as I would like to call it, I feel that some of it is natural, but I feel like it does need some kind of intervention with training and facilitation. I don't feel art can be taught because it's highly intuitive, but I feel that craft can be taught, and it does make you go a long way in terms of just becoming developing expression. Whether that's like you know, de- yeah, well, I would just say, yeah, developing expression. It goes a long
So,
way in that.
so
So
you said
there's a balance.
art versus craft, right? So
Yeah.
it can be any artist could then be considered somewhere on that spectrum of art versus craft. Do you think, in your experience, it has you found that there is any perfect balance?
I feel like yes, the balance had to be sought by myself. Um, I feel like, you know, over time with workshops, for instance, were a space to let me help me kind of learn my craft and, develop that kind of balance that we're talking about. But a lot of it had to be sought on my own. So by like reading the kind of writers I liked, imitating them, um, like I think a lot of our early art comes from imitation, and just kind of like practicing techniques to kind of help find that balance. It's always a kind of tricky thing, but I feel that once you feel you have a voice and something very important to say, like even if it seems mundane, but if it's like something you feel it's valuable enough for you to say, and you develop a craft around it, you will eventually find that balance between kind of feeling and crafting that emotion on paper.
In your like personal journey, what has your personal style's evolution been like? I know you just said one begins with imitation, but then I want you to talk about your journey and your evolution of your personal style.
I feel like my style has moved from a lot of image based writing to I used to write heavily like image based writing, and this is a kind of very a particular way of saying it. It's because I was studying some of the very image heavy based poets from the modernist poets, and for instance, Sylvia Plath was one of my very first inspirations, and she is like a very heavily image based poet. And when I was starting out in my master's, I would say I was writing very heavily image based poetry. But one of the things that I've kind of transitioned from is moving from the image to a style that is like more, perhaps I would say, plain spoken, more focused on like just telling the reader, displaying to the reader, a sense of, what you want to tell the world, what anything significant you want to say. So I would say that, I've moved from a very heavily image focused to a balance between kind of like showing the reader and telling the reader on the page, what I want them to kind of see from my poems.
You mentioned, about starting out, and that is something I really want to focus on because a lot of people who are going to hear, listen to this podcast might believe that they're poets, may not have the confidence to just put it out. So they might be just starting out in many different ways, right? And there is such a lack of confidence in your ability or even the presence of that ability at all to begin with, right? Um, in that phase, how can one just get some kind of confidence to, keep going? Do you have any tips for that?
I would say that ever since the pandemic, there's been like a wonderful kind of expansion of what the online space can do. And as you know, the world has kind of like shifted online. So there's so many opportunities for writers online to seek out than there had ever been before, than there had ever been when I was doing my MFA. You know, I didn't know a lot of the things that, you know, are accessible easily now. So a lot of writers are, giving workshops online. There's a lot of material out there to help you improve your craft, your voice. Because of course, you know, I think that writing, while it takes a lot of like solitude, it also takes community. So one of the things is to build your own community. Find people like you who enjoy the craft and the art, and develop a space and remain consistent. One of the main things is I feel that people will find at a young age, you will find spaces, but you will not remain consistent. And that's one of the greatest challenges to art, to remain consistent, to really believe, like I said earlier, that you have something to say and to put out in the world out there. So it takes a bit of both, you know, that kind of belief and to back it up with that consistency. um, and I do believe that there are a lot of kind of avenues online which people can benefit from, especially with respect to Pakistan. I feel that there are a number of opportunities that I've seen like around in like on Instagram, on online, just floating through, workshop for writers, people trying to just kind of create groups around the writing, and just that community space as I was talking about.
So you're right. There are a lot of spaces created online, workshops, all those things happening. And that leads me to my next set of questions. It's just amazing how you just are helping me to, my questions that I already have in mind. Can poetry be good or bad? I'll tell you why I'm asking this. I'm asking this because I'm sure you must have noticed the snark. A lot of people have this kind of snark about certain kind of pop poetry. Pop poetry. Do you think about the whole scholarly versus viral poetry syndrome?
I'm not really sure how I feel about this, because I feel like popular poetry, like someone like Rupi Kaur, for instance, speaks to a lot of people, connects to a lot of people, and there's no saying if people find themselves in that kind of a poem, like, or poems by Rupi Kaur, that there's anything that we can invalidate in that. But then there is a kind of a simplicity of craft in her writing that makes, that kind of undermines the kind of work a lot of poets have done to develop and create meaning. I feel like every art, like every poem should have, or writing should have, kind of like certain elements that define good writing, and for one at the top of my head, I can think of, or two, I guess, some kind of um, element of surprise, perhaps, a good balance between showing and telling, but also some kind of depth. And I feel like what a writer, like, for instance, I don't know why I'm only thinking of Rupi Kaur, but perhaps just because, they're the most famous example.
Mm.
I feel like Rupi Kaur's writing tends to get, is oversimplified. Sometimes it veers on the stereotypical, which does have a tendency to kind of veil the honest experience of somebody. Um, and so, I think that debate does hold over, is it easy to just get away by typing a few words on the keyboard and putting them on an Instagram post, versus really honing and developing your craft by reading the generations of writers that have come before you, to kind of craft that level of depth in meaning in your words.
So if I hear you right, you're saying um, there has to be, in order for you to have some kind of depth, words on paper are just not enough. Oversimplification of a message is just not enough. There has to be, for it to be considered a craft, it has, for it to dig in deeper, one should be reading up more on about the craft. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, definitely reading and practicing as well.
Fair enough. I think that makes sense. We talked about Ruby Core. We talked about something like, workshops, everything. We've talked a bit about your personal, style evolution. I'm going to take us back again. to
Mhm.
your personal journey, and I want to talk about what was it like when you were published for the first time. There's always a story there.
I was published for the first time when I was in my last year in Fulbright, 2014. And I don't really remember. I just remember how ecstatic I was. Um, and the kind of, sense of validation it gives you that there's someone who believes in your words. You still feel that way. I feel like until you don't publish your first book, um, that feeling retains, it stays with you, because there is so much failure in the publishing world. There's so much failure for a writer before they can actually, if ever, enjoy the fruits of success. So that first experience was and there were, I think, a number of first experiences, because I remember in 2014 I had like a few like first publications, and it was just, yeah, absolutely a very joyful, validating moment for me to be published for the first time.
And like you said, before you were published for the first time, I'm sure there must have been so many rejections, right? And
Yes.
writing is like such a molten and personal process. So rejections are a part and parcel of the world we live in then. So then how did you deal with the rejections back then? And how have you evolved in your dealing with the rejections now?
I was lucky to have a lot of kind of like cushioning around what the rejection world would look like. So your professors would tell you that, it maybe take 10 years before you get out of this institution to have your book out there in the world. Don't believe that even if you're published, um, you won't have to go back and revise that work. Don't believe even if you've published, 40 poems, you can just put them together and make them a collection. They were giving you kind of like hard tips on how the market works. But obviously it's always like, a kind of blow to the ego to feel rejected. And it became sometimes even more of a blow in those periods when I was away from, when I came back from Sarah Lawrence to Pakistan, and I didn't know what my writing future would look like. So it became, a kind of, it can be disillusioning, definitely. But at the same time, I did have the knowledge that I have to develop a thick skin against rejections. You also have the examples of, many great writers before you, like Charlotte Bronte. I don't know how many hundreds of times her novel Jane Eyre was rejected before she actually got published. So those are the kind of things that sustain you and, kind of make you realize that it's okay, that this is the process. Um, and there's one part of writing that is writing and developing yourself as a writer, creating truth and meaning. And then there's the other part, success, what it looks like to the world. So it's important to kind of delineate between those two and not let it kind of break your spirit.
Developing yourself as a writer, and we have touched upon it, in different ways in this conversation so far. I kind of want to dig in deeper to that part. um, One thing is obviously you're developing yourself as a writer when it comes to the craft, learning new things, right? Reading more perhaps.
Mhm.
Another thing is your life, you know, your life and your experiences changing you.
Mhm.
Something you said earlier in this conversation is about distance. I
Yes.
imagine distance, was also developing you in different ways in
Mhm.
your, and that would reflect in your craft. Can you talk about life and experience and how it has shaped you as a writer now?
A lot of the material that I write about is about, the kind of movements I've made across the world. So I was born in Saudi Arabia, and then I moved to Toronto, Canada for a while, completed high school there. And then I moved to Pakistan, and then I moved to, US, and then back to Pakistan and back to US. So I feel, those kind of displacements, the sense of not having, but not having a home, the sense of a lack of belonging, um, the sense of continuous displacement is one thing that has really, really informed my way of writing and the subjects that I write about. The question of belonging is an important thing that I feel that I'm always seeking in my poems. And the question of belonging kind of features itself through various manifestations. It can be either status as a woman in Pakistan, um, my cultural position, my linguistic position, as a woman in Saudi Arabia, or as a woman in Pakistan, or as a woman in the United States, et cetera, et cetera. So, displacements along the lines of class, language, gender identity. That I think that I gradually, the displacements around geography helped me kind of further delineate that, what displacements can look like on these other levels as well. And gradually, I think those made the kind of uh, bucket list of things that I write about.
So when you're writing and you're using, your fluid identity um, as inspiration in your writing, do you find the ideas coming from a place of angst or exploration?
I feel that both. Initially, they used to come from a place of angst. And I think that's a really good question, because when you're a young writer, they will most likely come from a place of angst, because you don't have the craft to back up that world, that intense world of feeling that you have in you. But gradually, you have to want to love and want to experience, want to kind of deconstruct that place of angst. And that's what I mean by what I said before, was displacement for me was just like, oh, I don't belong here, I don't belong there, I don't belong anywhere. It was just kind of like that kind of splashing of feeling. But then, you have to interrogate that feeling, like, in what ways do you feel you do not belong? And so to do that, you have to become an explorer of your own journey and of your own angst in a way. And you have to kind of really go down there with a deconstructive eye. And so it takes both. You don't want to forget that initial sense of angst either, that kind of naivety of feeling. I think every writer has to retain that in order to kind of trust that the words will, carry that through the page. So it's a delicate balance between the two.
So in this entire process of exploration, you've written, I'm sure you've written so many poems. And I'm about to ask something which I personally also think is a terrible, terrible question, but I'm still going to go ahead and ask this. Do you have your favorites among your own poems?
Um, yeah, it's not that terrible of a question. It's just one that's difficult to answer because my relationship changes, with every new poem I write. So it's difficult to say. I know that's the thing, I know the worst ones that I've written, but I can't say if I have any favorites. I don't think so.
Let's talk about the worst one then. And why do you think that?
Well, I guess some of the ones that seem like really pretentious, and I don't really have a better way of explaining it, but they seem like they're really trying to do something hard, but they're actually feeling bad at it. And I guess this isn't really, I don't think it's available online, but it's in print. It's one of my poems called The Simplest Shape. To kind of backtrack from there, even the worst ones are kind of learning experiences, moments, teachable moments for me. So I once wrote this poem from the perspective of a suicide bomber, and I feel that that was a very wrong place to kind of go in terms of my privilege, also my position, like what do I know about that psychology. So I can consider that as a really like bad experience in terms of writing, or a bad poem, but it was a teachable moment for me to perhaps not to go to a place of writing about a certain reality, or a certain experience that I don't know much about.
Very interesting that you brought that up, because pretense, right? And I think about that personally as well. I think artists would tend to think about this contamination. Do you sometimes, like you said, feel like, you've been contaminated, and it that needs a creative, that entire creative process to flow, you need to cleanse yourself creatively to do it again? What I mean by that is, sometimes some people are, let's just say, inspired to just rule out, these quick poems, three lines, and that's a poem, to just put it out there so that they're getting external validation. So one could be external validation. One could, it could be an array of things that could contaminate one's creative process. And then how do you hold yourself accountable to that?
Yeah, I feel like, once again, a very beautiful question. I feel that it's very easy to be lured by successes and, market pressure. And I think those are the things that can very easily contaminate your work. But I feel like sometimes, well, the way I feel like I'm very lucky. First of all, I think I should place that first, that I'm very privileged that, I'm in a position where I don't need to have a book out there to secure my future. There are people who do have to do that, who have to put out a book out there, and that may contaminate the art. Um, I feel like I have the kind of systems that can, help me kind of backtrack and say, okay, if I'm not being 100% true, I can kind of step back and put that poem aside, or put that, cycle of poems aside, and let it rest and do something else. So that's usually the way I do it, to answer your question. I just step back. It's more intuitively that I can tell that I'm being dishonest in my work and I'm not putting like my 100% out there. The idea of contamination kind of depends on a variety of factors. But the best way is to kind of really just interrogate if you're being 100% true to myself. And that's really, yeah, I think it just naturally comes up. By this stage, by having so much experience in writing, it comes up naturally.
Yeah, yeah, I imagine. Do you ever find yourself going back to your old poems, reading them, and then wanting to fix them?
I've actually been doing a lot of that. I feel like, some of the greatest things our professors told us was not to throw away your old work, especially for someone like me who was like highly critical of myself. Starting earlier out, I learned to develop like self-compassion very late in my life towards my art. But I didn't throw most of my work. Like, for, I still have my master's thesis, which I find terrible. But looking back at it, I drew a lot of the things from it. A lot of like lines, and develop and brought them into new poems. But also, I'm working on a poem that I wrote in like 2013, and I'm completely revamping it. So that work has its own value in its own time. It's badly written, sure, but it's still part of the journey of what I'm writing today. So I do a lot of that.
Yeah, I understand. So what are you writing today? What are you working on currently?
So I'm working on my dissertation project, which is a manuscript of poems. And to put it very loosely, it kind of explores, it's set in, all these four countries that I've lived in. And it has a bit of, my experience of growing up, adolescence experience in Saudi Arabia, my transition to Pakistan. A lot of the themes that I focus around in those poems about Pakistan are about, sadly, violence. I know it sounds so cliched the way I put it, but I feel it's true to my experience. Um, Violence, gendered violence, public violence. And then, but a lot of the poems are also very personal, about like my mother and my father and my mom's relationship to cooking, and my relationship to my mom's relationship to cooking. So they're poems around food. Um, and then there's some poems that are like very loosely, about America, which I'm still trying to, figure out what, how to ground them, because I feel like I don't have that distance once again from America to write about it. So, on like a broader umbrella level, I would just say, the dissertation project loosely examines this transnational experience of moving from, like, between all these countries.
Hira, when you're writing about such deeply personal, stories and experiences, and you're putting them out with a chance of, hopefully them being published and being read by, thousands, if not, millions,
Mhm.
um, you're also like exposing yourself, right? You're putting it's How do you deal with that? Did you find yourself at any point in your journey having to deal with that idea of, oh my God, I'm exposing myself to everyone, everyone's going to know my story?
Yes, it is uncomfortable. Mostly the ones, first of all, I think you have to figure out who you're uncomfortable to exposing yourself to. Um, I feel like within a community of writers who are writing subjects similar as me, I feel more or less understood or more or less like validated just by way of the subjects they write. Sometimes you write subjects that are so deeply personal, but you can find a way, and this may sound very abstract, but you can find a way within the poem to kind of manipulate the truth in a way that it doesn't become about that particular person or that particular thing, so that you can create a kind of ambiguity around it to protect yourself, especially if it's a very kind of a vulnerable experience for you, of an experience in which you feel that exposure might kind of threaten you in some way, the exposure of that art piece to the world. That's one way. Another way is kind of building around yourself a fortress of kind of privacy. So like, I think the online medium allows a lot of that. You've written a poem, it's published into the world, but you're not directly face to face the way actors would be, in a crowd of people. So you do have that kind of invisibility that the online platform provides you. I can't say for how it will change if, for instance, I write a novel tomorrow and I have to speak about it. Likely for poems, for poets, I mean, you do have that kind of public exposure, but it's not at the level, I think, of that novelists will have. So I try to, basically, to put it short, I think I try to create a little distance between, myself and the audience, but I won't say that it's never not comfortable. I mean, you have to ultimately come to a place where you have to decide whether you feel this is worth the exposure or not. And sometimes it's not. And sometimes you have to kind of just set it aside. And there may be a better moment in life where you can write that piece of work and you can put it out there.
Hera, I had so much fun talking to you today.
Me too.
I wanted to just keep going on, but thank you so much for your time today. All right, you have a good day ahead. I'll be in touch.
You too. Take care. Bye-bye.